Psalm 3, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. Well, welcome back to Learning to Worship from the Psalms. Today we are looking at Psalm 3, and Psalm 3 is the first psalm that starts after the prologue of Psalms 1 and 2. And this psalm begins with a superscription, which is a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. And so it's automatically kicking our minds back to 2 Samuel when we can remember that Absalom staged a rebellion. He took over the city. David and all of his loyal subjects had to flee in the night, and they ran away, and they basically fled from Absalom. There was a bunch of warring going on until Absalom was killed. And this psalm is supposed to make you think back to that time. Not only do we have the situation that the psalm is making us think back to, but also it is in relation to Psalms 1 and 2. Psalm 1 began that, happy is the person who is continually meditating on God's law. They're like a tree. The wicked are like chaff. They're going to be blown away in the wind. There's a path of the righteous. There's a path of the wicked. The Lord looks after the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Psalm 2 talks about how the Lord laughs at all these kings of the earth that are coming together to throw off the chains of God and his anointed king. Now we have this story of someone who is wanting to throw off his dad's kingship. You don't even see the victorious kingly reign of Psalm 2 in this psalm. You see the king is on the run. He's surrounded by enemies. So it automatically throws you back into this situation where the king is being persecuted. He's being wronged by the enemy. And they are saying that God isn't going to help them at all. So that is where we are today. And I wanted to look at several key components of this psalm when it comes to thinking about worship and thinking about the world and the world view of the Psalms. The first thing that we want to look at is the word salvation occurs 3 times. The Hebrew root occurs 3 times, and we have that in verse 2 where they are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Then verse 7, he says, arise, O Lord, save me, which is the same root. It's just a shorter version. And then down into verse 8, where it says, salvation belongs to the Lord. So the key term of salvation is present. And this isn't just talking about like a spiritual salvation, like God's going to let me go to heaven when I die. This is about rescue. This is about coming through for David, for the psalmist. The only metaphor in this psalm is that of a shield. and he says, you are a shield about me. You are all around me as a shield. And this makes us have to think back to the other times that God promised to be a shield to his people. The first time that we see this term is in Genesis chapter 15, where God says to Abraham, I am your shield, I am your very great reward. And so he had promised to be a protection for Abraham as he was bringing about this chosen people, this family that he was going to use for the promise of the seed. And here we see David saying, you are my shield about me. There is also another promise in Deuteronomy 33:19, where God promises to be a shield for his people Israel. And so David is just tapping into that promise. He's saying, look, you've always promised that you're going to be a shield for your people. I believe that you're a shield about me, even though I'm surrounded by all these enemies. And in the context of this psalm, enemies has a very military feel to it. It's referring to armies. It's not just any random enemy, but he is being surrounded by these enemies. He has people on all sides, but he's able to lay down and to sleep, which I don't know about you, but I have a struggle if I have any fear. If I have anything weighing on my mind at all, we just tend to not rest very well. But he's able to lay down and go to sleep, and he says to rise up. And the beautiful thing about this is that term rise up is just a way of saying I wake up in the morning, but it also makes us think about the story of Jesus, where when Jesus was surrounded by all of his enemies, he did lie down and sleep in death. But then he was able to rise up and have victory over the enemy of sin and death. And so in this, we see David is saying more than he knew, I believe. He is saying, I'm able to go to sleep. I'm able to wake up because the Lord sustains me. But then also, we get a bigger picture here as well. And also, if we look at Psalm 3 talking about lying down and being able to wake up, Psalm 4 talks about going to sleep at night. And so these two psalms together seem to have been put next to each other to be a morning psalm and a night psalm. And so as people who are now picking up these psalms and using them for our own prayer, for our own thought and meditation, it might be a great practice if we would just note this down, maybe copy it off, print off a nice version of it and put it up somewhere on a mirror where we could read it in the morning and just say this psalm, because so many of the things that we face in the day, we view as opponents, we view as enemies. But maybe this psalm would be a good help to remind you that the Lord can be a shield about you and sustain you in that time. Also, the term "rise up, Lord" was the very first part of a phrase that would be said by the priest as they would take the Ark of the Covenant at the head of the battle line. And as they would go forth into war, they would say, "Rise up, O Lord," and then they would continue. And then when the ark would return, they would say, "Return, O Lord." So this is calling back the idea of the Ark of the Covenant, which was a symbol of God's presence with his people. This is a cry that God's presence would be with David. Next, I want to talk to you about breaking the teeth of the wicked, because this depends. Maybe this makes you cringe a little bit, or maybe if you're a very vindictive kind of person, this is like exactly your jam. You just want to shatter somebody's jaw. But no matter what your take is on that, what we want to look at is that David is asking God to do this for him. He is not saying, I'm going to shatter the teeth of the wicked. He's asking God to do that. Now, if you remember, in the very first psalm, it talks about the chaff being dispelled. If you remember the second psalm, he talks about the rod of iron that will be used by the Lord's anointed to shatter the enemy like pottery. And this is a very similar metaphor where he's asking God to break the power of the wicked. Now, whether or not the teeth here are a symbol of ferocity, like, taking away their bite, being able to do damage and inflict damage, or if you had a mouth full of broken teeth, you also don't have the ability to talk, and very well at least. And at the very first part of the psalm, it seems like the enemy that's surrounding David is kind of talking behind his back and saying, there's no help from God in him. And this is just another way of saying, shut your mouth, and God silencing people. However you look at that, and I think both of them are probably true together. What we see is that he is asking God to do this. He's not saying, you know what, I'm the Lord's Messiah. I'm going to take this rod of iron and I'm going to shove it into the mouth of the wicked and shatter all their teeth. This is a place where he does not yet have the rod of iron. He has not been given that status. And ultimately, that's going to come to Jesus at the end, separating the wheat from the chaff. And ultimately, evil will be silenced forever. Now, the psalm ends with David's cry that God's blessing would be on his people. Now, when we think of God's blessing being on his people, we should think back to Numbers chapter 6, where God had given a blessing to the priest to declare over his people from the altar during the sacrifice. And they were to stand up and say, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and give you peace. This is probably the blessing that David is referring to, where God's face would shine on his people, where God would give them peace. And so we are seeing that David isn't just asking for this peace from enemies alone, he's also asking this on behalf of his people. And so we see here a cry for deliverance from an enemy. We see that cry is directed to God. We see that the ultimate heart is always to remind God of his covenant that he made with his people, of his presence and his blessing. And we also see that there is a deep trust in God, deep enough to where even though we are surrounded by all of this, we can lie down and sleep knowing that we're going to wake up. And even if we sleep in death, we know that ultimately one day we will wake up in the resurrection. So God bless you. I hope that you dig deeper into Psalm 3, reread it and reread it. It will yield fresh insights every time. And if you find some great insights that I haven't shared here, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Have a great day, and God bless.